Uh, so welcome everyone to BeyondPhrenology. And today we have with us Louise Barrett. You might know Louise Barrett from her very famous book called Beyond the Brain. Well, I had read that book far back a few years back, and I did not know who Louise was until I met her in a workshop at Emory University in Atlanta in May. And even there, I didn't recognize her until I talked to her and she says, "I'm Louise Barrett." And I was like, "Oh, so I'm with Louise Barrett now." And we had an awesome workshop there. And I got a lot about Louise Barrett's work. And she gave an awesome presentation of embodied cognition and describing some parts of her book. And here we have her with us. She's a full professor of psychology at Lethbridge University in Canada, Alberta. And I also was fortunate to have her as my co-author on a book chapter for a book I'm editing. And here we have her. Louise, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Very nice to be.
Something in the introduction I missed, necessary to introduce you. You would like to add?
No, that was pretty good. That was pretty good. Very flattering.
Thank you. So Louise, let's start with a quote from your book. You said there's no such thing as a naked brain. And I guess, at least to me, I know you most regarding things that revolve around that quote. So what do you mean by saying that there's no such thing as a naked brain? And what made you say that? What prompted you to say that?
Well, I think the main thing that prompted me to say that is the way in which when one is taught psychology and neuroscience, you're taught about the brain as this isolated or hermetically sealed organ that does all the cognitive work. And so you don't have to worry about how an organism is put together. You don't have to worry about the environment in which it lives, its niche or anything like that, because you just have to worry about what's going on in the brain, and that will provide a sufficient explanation of how brains work and what they do, what their function is. And as someone who is trained in ecology, that seemed to me inherently odd, because you're always thinking of like the context in which an organism lives is important to explaining its behavior. And I also, as someone who studies animal behavior, and you're dealing with the vast array of different bodies that are out there and the different kinds of intelligence that animals show, and you've got like octopuses and things with wings and things whose arms are as long as their legs, and things that swim in the ocean and all these kinds of things. And it's like that somehow none of that makes any difference to their ability to their cognition and how their brains work. Like, their bodies matter so little. I just couldn't see how ignoring an animal's body was going to be able to explain how cognition worked and the evolution of cognition throughout the animal kingdom. It just seemed there was something missing there, because it treated brains as though a brain was a brain was a brain. And that can't possibly be true, given the wide variety of bodies that we see. And so that's what prompted me to start looking into these things in more detail and looking for alternatives to the kinds of treating brains as computers and treating brains as information processors that were taking input, transforming it, and producing output in a way that allowed you to just study all brains in the same kind of way and apply what you found to a vast array of organisms that varied in their behavior and their basic body design so much. So that's where it all came from, really.
There's a lot to unpack there. So let's start with let me be a devil's advocate, and I'll say that when we study kidneys, for example, nobody makes an argument there's no such thing as a naked kidney, or there's no such thing as a naked adrenal gland. We study, like nephrologists study kidney in its own as an entity. And one can make an argument that the kidney function very much depends on whether you're walking fast, whether you're walking slow, whether you are in the gym, or you're lying around home, or it's sunny or not. But we never think of organs like kidney, liver, and heart, in the sense that, it has a body in which it is encased and the body is moving, and we need to understand the body function as well while studying those organs. So what's special about the brain that we need to include the body and it prompted you to say that.
Well, I mean, I would push back on that a little bit, that in a sense we just study the kidney and the lungs and the heart. I think we understand that part of what the kidney's doing is helping to keep a body going in a very important way, and it's doing a job for the body, and you're taking into account the way a kidney functions as a larger system. And I think, but at the same time, I think you're absolutely onto something here, because I mean, Peter Hacker, the philosopher, he sort of always says, when he talks about people who write about the brain and how they talk about the brain making hypotheses and, you know, test and all these kinds of ways in which brains are spoken about, he sort of says, if the brain, why not the kidney? And he's quite right. You know, why are we treating brains as somehow different from the other organs in the body? And I think I think it's an interesting question, and I think two contributions to that answer are, I think when you look at a heart, you can see that it's pumping. Do you know what I mean? It's like you can see the heart pumping. When you look at the structure of a kidney, you can see it operates like a filter.
And you can measure that.
If you look at a brain, it looks, I don't know, it's like porridgey, you know, jello-y stuff. You can't really see what it's doing. And when you look at it, I mean, for all we know, like if we didn't have a better understanding now, I mean, you could sort of forgive Aristotle for going, yeah, it's sort of that cools your blood. That's for your brains, for cooling your blood, and it's your heart that's, you know, controlling all your behaviors and all these kinds of things. So I think there's this it's more difficult. It's been more difficult to think of like the role the brain plays as part of the body as a whole. And then you get these metaphors that come about that are thinking of brains in ways that divorce it from how it functions in a body. Do you know what I mean? Like all they're like, the metaphors are very, like most things, are very technological, but they're like, you know, wax tablets or filing cabinets or telegraph systems or computers. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
They're sort of removed. There's a sense in which it gets removed from the body and treated as though, and once we've come to this recognition that the brains are vital for behavior, that once you remove the brain or the brain is damaged in some way, the whole of the rest of the body stops, then you can see how it's like, well, this is the only bit that really matters, and this is the bit that we need to study. And once we understand how the brain works, then everything else will follow. So I don't have a really good answer for it, but there's definitely a way in which the brain is considered as something that sits outside the body, and maybe that comes from or not sits outside the body, obviously, but is something very distinct from the rest of the body. There's a material difference between a brain and the body. We don't think of brains and bodies together. And you know, that's a problem, I think. And maybe that also comes from a particular Western philosophical tradition where you're thinking of you've got a separation between mind, you know, soul and body, between mind and body, and then the next thing you know, you've got brain and body, and now the mind or the soul goes into the brain, and of course it's distinct from the body. So I think you've got those two things.
Right. We often say that, you know, we never say that my lungs are breathing hard, or, you know, my lungs are feeling suffocated, but we always say like my brain is thinking.
This hurts my brain. My brain is exactly. Right. So there's a sort of like this, it's like there is this other little person who lives inside you, like your brain is a person in and of itself. And I mean, that gets perpetuated by people who work on brains. You know, I've been to several talks with neuroscientists. I remember going to a talk with Chris Frith, who's a very famous neuroscientist, and continually throughout his talk, he kept saying, and your brain knows more about this than you do. And, you know, your brain knows better than you do on this one. And it's like, but I thought I was, you know, but he sort of started his talk saying, you are your brain. You have to make sure that you look after your brain. It's the only one you've got, and all that thing. And so you are your brain, but at the same time, your brain can know more than you do. And it's like, well, who's me? And who's in, you know, how many me's are there if I can be somehow separate from my brain, and my brain can do things I don't know about? And so I think we're kind of terminally confused about all this, really.
So when did this confusion started? Is there any set point in history where we can trace that this is where we started considering our brain as like a, you know, kind of a ghost in the machine or something of that kind?
I mean, well, we know sort of in the history of Western philosophy, when you get to Descartes and you get to the scientific revolution and those kinds of those kinds of eras, you've got this separation between mind and body in the way that, I mean, Descartes is very interesting because I think if you read it, you should read what he says. He's fascinated by clockwork, the invention of clockwork. These are miraculous. He doesn't think of these things as somehow you're denigrating organisms or denigrating anything to say that it's like clockwork, because he thinks because clockwork's this miraculous new invention. So you've got all these clockwork mechanisms and you can see how a body can be clockwork. And then the one thing that he can't work out is, like, given how flexible and various human reason is, the idea of making a mechanism that could deal with all the things that human reason does, it just seems inherently implausible. So he says there must be this other special mind stuff that does that, because I just don't see how you can make a mechanism that could achieve such flexibility, such inventiveness and imagination of and reason. And that's a challenge. That's like a challenge that he put forward. And I don't think we've really necessarily answered that. I think, his challenge still stands. But then, so that's how you get this separation of body and mind. And then with the rise of, with the cognitive revolution in the 50s, and then subsequently with people working in areas of evolutionary psychology, they just said, oh no, there's no ghost in the machine. There's no special mind stuff. But then they just made the mind into, they just went, yeah, Descartes was wrong. There's just all these modules. They all add up. You can have a completely mechanical mind. And so mind became a machine. And we got rid of the ghost in the machine, but we just made the mind into a machine. And we didn't consider that the machine, and there's no question that the machine is that the mind is still like entirely within the body, that you've got a completely hermetically sealed mind that's inside the body, and it's just another mechanism. And that's how we did it. But at the same time, it retained this specialness that makes it distinct from all our other mechanisms.
So, and what makes the inertia, like what prevents the change now? I mean, given that you have written the book and a lot of other people have written things along similar lines, and there's a whole community of ecological psychologists, for example, and inactivists, and different subfields and phenomenologists, right? And they all are trying to argue along the same lines that we have to think of brain not as an entity in itself, but as part of a functional organism which is trying to interact with the environment and basically trying to survive and reproduce, leave the progenies. So what's the inertia? What's preventing us from moving along this direction? And what exactly is at stake here? If we don't change the way we think about brain, what are we losing?
I mean, these are very, very good questions. I think we need to do more in terms of looking at the sociology of science and the history of science to get at them. I just know that when I discuss things with neuroscientist colleagues, they just don't see it as any kind of problem to study the brain in the way that they're studying it, and they don't have any problem with thinking of it as a computer. They don't have any problem with talking about information processing. They think it's completely obvious that brains compute. They think it's completely reasonable to use particular kinds of model organisms. And I think it's maybe because it kind of works. You can just carry on doing neuroscience day in, day out, and you don't have to think about the other ways in which we think, because they're interested in trying to find out, often they're interested in finding cures for things like Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease, which their argument is sit in the brain. They sit inside the brain. They're interested in learning, which they conceptualize as like Hebbian learning. You're just looking at how neurons start firing together. So I think they can just carry on doing what they're doing without having to consider these broader issues, because they don't really think in deeply evolutionary ways, and they're not trying to explain the variety of different kinds of minds there are out there. They're just trying to explain how the brain works, right? And that's what they're doing. And so I just think you end up with people moving along parallel tracks, because you can be very successful within neuroscience without anyone ever coming along and into, raining in your parade with these kinds of inactivist ecological discussions. And we're in this other sort of, I don't want to say silo, but it kind of is a silo. You end up with a set of people who all share your ideas, and you have discussions with them, and you make progress in that way, and you tap into those people, and you don't necessarily touch on the others. So I would say that I wrote a book, and the people who took most notice of it were a lot of philosophers and a lot of ecological psychologists, and a small number of people in animal behavior and cognition, people who are already working in that similar kind of area, like Dorothy Fugazi, who is interested in affordances and tool use. Yeah. And then everyone else just like ignored it. Like, it was sort of like, oh, that's an interesting idea.
Right.
And, like in the way you just go, oh, that's different.
Right. Like, it's beautiful. Yeah. So a lot to unpack here. Let's start with the computation. Okay, like the brain is a computer. And you, in fact, you have a chapter in your book where you're talking about Alan Turing. And a lot of contemporary neuroscientists attribute the whole computation ideas to Alan Turing, that that he started thinking about the brain as a computer first, and basically then we have different kind of computational architectures, and now we follow certain architectures kind of implicitly in neuroscience. But you have a very interesting chapter in your book where you talk about why Turing was not thinking of brain as a computer in the sense how we interpret about his work. So could you elaborate on that a little bit? And I found it very insightful, and that's where I collaborated with you to write this book chapter, and also a book you cite by
So that's the whole of that chapter is really a tribute and explanation of Andrew Wells's analysis of Turing machines and how he thought about. And I think, his book is Rethinking Cognitive Computation. It's one of the best books ever. I just absolutely love that book. And he also wrote he's also got another one called The Literate Mind, which I can also recommend. And extremely nice man. So there it is. Excellent. Yes, there it is. And a really fantastic book. And what he does in that, which I found really fascinating. Well, one, it's like I learned a lot, right? Because that's the story I had heard, that Alan, the notion of Turing machines and the notion of universal Turing machines, and these are a model of the brain, and what Andrew Wells does in his book is he says, well, what Alan Turing was trying to do was to work out how to be more efficient in terms of computing numbers. And if we go back to the 50s and we go back to the second, even further back than that, in the Second World War, computers were people who sat at desks with a pen and paper working out sums, and a computer was a person. Yeah. That was the name, that was the description of the task they were doing. They were computing, they were computers. And so what Turing was trying to do was to create a model of a person with a piece of paper doing some sums and working out the answers. And he was trying to sort of mechanize that and make it more efficient. And so the Turing machine, which is not a real machine, it's a model, it's a theoretical entity, is you have a read-write tape head, and you have an infinite paper tape, and the read-write head can print symbols onto the tape, and it can read the tape, and it moves along, and as it moves backwards and forwards and goes and prints and reads, and it can work out and solve any algorithm. And so that whole contraption of the read-write head and the paper tape and was treated as, then everyone sort of then took it and treated it as like a model of the mind. So it went boom, straight into the head. And what Andrew Wells does in his book is lay out, in fact, how that's completely wrong, because the infinite paper tape is the piece of paper that people are writing on, it's the equivalent of graph paper, and he just made it into this infinite one-dimensional paper tape because that's the easiest way to do it. That makes it more tractable. And the read-write head is the person, writing on the sums. And he also, Andrew Wells, creates this thing of like what he calls a mini mind, which is like, so the person is still there. And the whole Turing machine is really a model of a person in the world, a person in an environment doing some sums. So I think the really nifty move that Andrew Wells makes is then to say, so this is an ecological contraption. This is an ecological entity. This is very akin to what James Gibson was talking about. Turing machines are ecological. And it's like, whoa, like, that just like blew my mind. And then he goes on to explain how we can understand computation in an ecological frame that is completely compatible with what James Gibson said. And I thought that was a remarkable thing to do. And it's such a stimulating and rewarding book to read.
I agree with you. When I read, I was like, how did I miss that? And that's like one of the greatest insights I ever saw on paper. And what is interesting in this, when you read the book on page 5, Andrew Wells give examples of very famous thinkers like Dan Dennett and Steven Pinker and a couple of other famous, I would say you can call them philosophers of mind sciences. And their description of Turing, and they're blatantly wrong. So it seems like most people either did not read Turing properly or misinterpret Turing to make computer as a model of the brain and the mind.
Yeah. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing, isn't it? And that's why I think that the answers to your other questions are really knotty, and you really have to work through historically to kind of, where do you find the point at which everyone made that wrong move and it kind of gained momentum. So these are kind of interesting historical questions, because I don't understand it either. And the other thing that comes in that is he brings in Gibson, which makes complete sense, and he does this beautiful analysis of showing how you can, like, how you can understand configurations of a Turing machine in a Gibsonian way. Really, really fascinating stuff, very clever. And the other thing is, there's many people who have no idea who James Gibson is, even though he was one of he was a famous and leading experimental psychologist of his time. And they might know Eleanor Gibson, they might know his wife Eleanor Gibson and her work, her developmental work, and they'll probably know the visual cliff. That's it. That'll be it. All the very clever stuff about perceptual learning that they wrote about, things that Eleanor Gibson went on to do. So there's this whole tradition and whole body of work that sits alongside all this other, but no one really knows about it in that same way. Do you know what I mean? It's really fascinating. It's like this whole shadow history of psychology that you could tell an alternative history of psychology that would be completely different from the one we get that goes from like Chomsky onwards into the cognitive revolution, blah, 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 blah. You could go, William James, John Dewey, and then through to people, like Gibson, and you could even bring in people like B.F. Skinner there in that more pragmatist set. You can have this through to embodied cognition people like Tony Shimero and Louis Favela, and all these people who are all doing these things in a completely that's around the same time. You can map the timings across, and it's a completely sort of shadow history of psychology that goes on, and that's not the one that people know about. Whereas to my way of thinking, that's the only one that's really doing proper psychology and making any sense, and it will make progress. I find these issues really interesting in terms of actually doing empirical work on these things, but the history of it continues to fascinate me. I don't understand how it could have turned out the way it's turned out.
I personally feel that Gibson was onto something, and he made a big dent in the universe, in those words. However, we had the advent of fMRI. Now, all thanks to fMRI, in terms of how much we know about disease and how much we can, for example, look at lesions and treat patients with brain disorders and things like that. But at the same time, fMRI did a lot of disservice, or a rapid adoption of fMRI, a lot of disservice to the Gibsonian way of thinking. And I think had fMRI not been invented during that time, and Gibson and ecological psychology would have got a little more time, probably a decade or two, things would have been a little different in mind sciences right now.
So what do you think it was about? What did fMRI do to sort of damage
It didn't damage. It didn't. It basically overshadowed the ecological approach, because when you can look at these beautiful pictures about the brain, now definitely resolution was low when fMRI started, but still you had these colorful pictures and you could see inside the brain, and then you suddenly it was like a gold rush towards that. Then looking, on those beautiful things and patterns and geometry which Gibson explored in his work.
Yeah. So do you think it is this thing that's one thing, like there's a particular technology that gets invented and everyone rushes to it, but do you think the other thing is that if you do that kind of neuroscience, although it's expensive and it's actually much easier than doing Gibsonian?
Of course, it is easier. You get it has a lot of money involved in it. It has some power involved in it. When you own these physical instrumentation, the kind of control we wield in our sociological life is very different. Even though we don't talk about very powerful philosophers, we do talk about powerful neuroscientists. So there's a sociological aspect of power associated with having those labs, I guess. And then the other thing is we invented electricity, so we can measure things much better in terms of current and magnetism. So a lot of what we think about the brain is also based on electrical ideas, because we could measure those first. Now, I just sometimes question myself that is it about, do neural firings do they really mean something, or they are epiphenomena of chemical transmission, and we do not have technologies to look at those chemical transmissions or that basically squirting of chemicals in the brain in that detail. So maybe it's our limited capacity that is limiting us to think of brain in that way. And let's talk about Gibson. So not many people know that Gibson had issues with hearing. So Gibson used to wear hearing aid, and there's a lot of funny stories about him, how he used to treat his hearing aid, and you can hear them from people, senior people who might have spent time with him. And no wonder that Gibson wrote a book called The Ecological Approach to Visual Perception. He thought about vision in a very different way. And that makes you wonder what the constraints imposed on you due to how you think about things. And now we have a physical constraint and the physical capability to look inside the brain using these machines. So all our metaphors and how we interpret about the brain are shaped by those machines and those sociological infrastructure, which I call it a neuroscientific industrial complex.
Yeah, but see, that's exactly. So that, to just go back to what the question you asked at the beginning, which is like, why do we think brains are not organs like kidneys? And I think that's where, again, like, the fact that it became an electrical system, we focused on, because it's full of chemicals. Your brain, you could easily characterize the brain as a chemical system and not as an electrical system, if you know what I mean. But we got it's like there's a book called The War of the Soup and the Sparks, and it's like the sparks won, right? So the brain becomes this electrical system, so to speak. And that, I think that also speaks to why we don't think of brains as other organs, because it gets this very clean machine, like, if you think of electricity and how how electronics work, it's not squishy and messy and full of things that squirt, right? Is it? So it's very easy to then, if you then start thinking in those ways of an electrical system, it seems very different from all the other squishy stuff that's going on in your kidneys and your heart, and that involves blood, and your kidneys are making urine, and your brain is like making pure information, it's making pure thought. It seems as though you are talking about it, even though everyone goes, I am not a dualist. I am
Yeah,
certainly not a substance dualist. There's a sense in which we still are if you're just thinking of information, and it's like this pure stuff that somehow manages to float above what neurons are actually doing. There's like this, it really does seem as though we are still dualists in that way. And thinking of, if you start thinking of things that squirt out, like neuromodulators and squirting out in your brain, and how the brain is very squishy and like porridgey in its texture, you can start thinking of the brain in a completely different way. And then it does suddenly become an organ like others. So I think you're right. I think it's exactly the way in which a particular metaphor and story really takes hold.
yeah.
And then you can't think differently because you get trapped in your own metaphor.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so for example, Damien, my friend, he always talks about brain as a mix of carbs, fats, and proteins, like a milkshake, right? And we have very different kind of fluid systems and fluid modeling techniques to look at how that system actually might be acting, compared to what we attribute to the brain. These clean binary action potentials, which have either 0 or 1, neurons fire or not fire, and somehow they're carrying information. And a lot of gaps, for example, which different philosophers have pointed out, like, who is the interpreter inside the brain? Where is the compiler? Where is the central clock? Where is the timing? How are signals synchronized, for example? These are the questions remain unanswered.
Yeah. And then the other thing about fMRI that you were saying, I mean, I remember Jaak Panksepp, Jaak Panksepp, and he was he was Mr. Effective Neuroscience. And, and I remember him saying to me, like, the reason why fMRI seems so great is because it's the equivalent of like Galileo's telescope. So it doesn't have very good resolution. So it is like this bit of the brain is going to light up but these other parts don't. So it seems as though you have localized functions. But he said, once you get to the equivalent of a Hubble telescope for fMRI, it won't tell us anything because all the brain will be doing something all the time, right?
Yeah.
You'll have such resolution and detectability that everything that happens, the whole brain will be involved. It will be like, and then it won't seem as though there's local, this localization, his view was that this is just an artifact of how fMRI doesn't have good resolution at the moment.
Yeah.
And
it's also the science of a lying person. I mean, there's so much about posture, especially when you're talking about humans. It's all about posture. We first need to control the posture, then do anything. Like even when I'm trying to speak to someone, my posture influences how I speak. And we know this from so many studies now, a big body of work. And we have a lying person inside fMRI. So whatever it tells, it's still very restricted to that state of posture. So, yeah. So that's about computation. And the second thing you mentioned a couple of minutes back was the model organism, our assumption that we can study any model organism to basically study anything. So what would you like to say on model organism? Are we using wrong model organisms, or are we overinterpreting what we are studying on those model organisms?
I think a model organism can be a bit like the kind of metaphor you use. Like you need a model. Sometimes, I mean, I'm a big fan of model. I don't have a problem with model organisms per se, but I mean, do you know? I can't remember who it is, but there's this bloke who's on the internet, and he's got this. I think it's a Twitter account, and when there are all these studies that are published, and it's like, microbiome affects cognition and he has this like algorithm, and it attaches the phrase "in mice" to any hyperbolic neuroscience title. Right?
Is it neuroskeptic? There's one.
I think it could be someone like that. Yeah, exactly. But I mean, the point is, like, so you get these hyperbolic titles for neuroscience papers, and the way they get presented in the media and indeed in the journals themselves, and he just sort of attaches "in mice" to them, and the whole point is to say this is happening in a mouse, and that's fine. It's a living creature and everything like that, but we have to remember it's not necessarily going to scale up to human, and it's not going to tell us that we're learning something, but we have to recognize the limitations of what we're learning. So I think I mean, obviously, what does a model organism allow you to do? It allows you to do things that would be unethical to do to human beings. Like you just couldn't do a lot of those things. You have fast generation times. So if you're interested in evolutionary processes, you can, if you broaden it out beyond neuroscience, you can look at evolutionary processes in real time. So there are all these advantages of why one would use a model organism that we all understand. But I think you have to then realize that these things don't necessarily scale up, or they don't apply across in that same way that you might imagine. So you just have to keep track of that. And I find, again, these are kind of interesting sociological, philosophical things, because when you have a model organism, you need it to be sort of sufficiently similar. So if you want to have like a model of autism, or a model of multiple sclerosis, or a model of Alzheimer's, it's got to be sufficiently similar that someone's going to, is going to have some applicability to Alzheimer's in humans. Or to be more cynical, it's got to be sufficiently similar that someone's going to give you money to carry on doing this. But at the same time, it can't be too similar to us, because then they'll get into these ethical issues of like, oh no, we can't do this to these creatures because they could be, good God, they could be having deep thoughts and count to 10, be conscious. And, do you know what I mean? So there's this whole push and pull the whole time, which is like, oh yes, this model applies very broadly, but oh no, they're not really like us, so it's fine that we kind of alter their genetics and ablate parts of their brain or whatever like that. So I think these things are really interesting in how we ourselves conceptualize model organisms so that we can do what we do. And I think that there's this interesting tension between treating a brain as though it's going to be a brain, and I think maybe that's where that comes from, that brains are brains, and there is such a thing as there's just a brain, and you can study it and understand it and apply it, and these things will apply broadly, because otherwise you'd get into all these difficult questions about the kinds of brains you were studying, and was it ethical to study them in particular ways, which we have seen with, like, there's less and less work on primates done on, brain work done on primates now, I think, for those reasons.
Especially the not invasive ones.
Invasive stuff. So I think these things are never just, you're never just talking about the value to science and how, or maybe you are, in the sense that we're wrong to think that science is anything other than a human activity like all other human activities.
In terms of ethics, I was listening to, I don't remember where I was, it was a couple of days back, and the person was talking about how our ideas of ethics are so distorted. So, for instance, that we can slaughter animals, we can go hunting, but at the same time, if we want to make a human walk and study how humans walk, we need to have a very extended IRB application, for example. You are allowed to kill animals, but you're not allowed to have sex with them, for example. Somebody might be loving animals, and there's a social taboo with that. But at the same time, you are allowed to kill them, and that's completely fine. So who decides, and how are these ethics decided? The person was just questioning that how distorted our views are, and how we impose them, and how we go along, and how they kind of constrain, again, our sociology and how we interact with animals and things of that sort.
And so I don't think the realm of science is any different to that. Like, all those similar kinds of human things are going on in exactly that same way.
Exactly. Whenever a discussion like that happens, summer salary always comes to my mind. How much of science, I mean, it might be a topic of study in itself, that how much of science is determined by summer salary requirements for tenure track or tenure professors than actually something else. So the desperation, and as a new assistant professor, I feel I'm first time feeling to be in the same issue. That what kind of pressure it can build, and how it can distort. It has a potential to distort science in unpredictable ways. So coming back to computation and model organism, the two major issues you highlighted, does it change how we look at disease? Because I can again play devil's advocate and say that, okay, no matter how we think about the brain or interpret about the brain, ultimately we are trying to understand, and whatever models we have, they might be wrong. Whatever metaphors we have might be wrong. But if I'm able to define Parkinson's or Alzheimer or some other motor disorder, for example, in those terms, and I can see an effect of medication or of a surgery or any intervention, even though the terminologies are wrong and the metaphors are wrong, it lets us progress in a very abstract way towards those clinical ends. So what's wrong with these? And given that they have been working, so do we have a choice now to go back a little bit, slow down a little bit, and correct ourselves in terms of our interpretation? Or we actually we double down on the speed of work because ultimately we are interested in curing diseases.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't disagree with you on that in the cases where we are indeed making progress and have made progress. But I would say that, for example, there is a lot of dispute in terms of in Alzheimer's research about whether it's going in the right direction and they're focusing on the right, it's like, what is it, the beta amyloid and the plaques and all that kind of thing. And it's like, well, it's not quite clear that is in fact the route that we should be going, because it's not explaining the things that we think it should be explaining. So when you invent a new drug, I was reading something about it, like you invent a new drug and the idea is that it will reduce the symptoms of Alzheimer's, and it will do that by reducing the number of plaques in the brain. And then you clinically test it, and it doesn't really have an effect it doesn't actually improve function. It doesn't improve cognitive function. But when you look at the patient after they've died, there are fewer plaques in the brain. So then they can say, oh, it worked, because on one level there are fewer plaques, but you haven't actually changed anything in terms of the progression of Alzheimer's. They still had so it's like, have we actually found are we going down the right track here? Because it doesn't seem like there is this relationship between the plaques and the cognitive functioning that we thought there was. And there's a sort of, the funding goes in one particular way. There's a lot of competition for funding, so other things don't get funded. So maybe it's like we need to have a sort of broader model of trying out and making sure that we're pursuing a lot of different avenues at once, because it's very likely that we could be wrong. So it's maybe not the notion that we shouldn't continue in these particular ways that have been working, because maybe we just need to broaden out the range of hypotheses that we're testing, because we could go down the wrong, alley. But so you're right. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think in terms of when you're talking about things like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, those are disorders of people's ability to function in the world. So you are kept in touch with the world more, aren't you? Because you're trying to help people function and behave in ways that are more functional in human society. So it's not sort of a pure thing of like how brains do their job. You have an end goal that is human functioning. The other thing I would say is, which comes from Margaret Locke, who's a medical anthropologist. She wrote a very good book about Alzheimer's, and her point was there's nothing wrong with the biomedical approach. There's nothing wrong with the ways in which we're going about this necessarily, but there's tons and tons of money being poured into this, and progress is not necessarily as fast as we would like it. And so there are many people now with Alzheimer's who are continuing to suffer and will not have any benefit of whatever medications are developed in the future, whatever cure comes about ultimately. But we know that if we took a more holistic view of the issue, those people could have a higher quality of life, because there are these particular, I think there's a like little village in Germany that's been set up for people with Alzheimer's. So it's like there's sort of, you can live independently and function independently, but everything is set up so that there are many, you can put you can put all these labels on all the doors of your cupboards and on your kettle, like turn the kettle off, take your tablets now. So you just offload a lot of the cognition and the cognitive load of remembering into the environment, and then people can continue to live independently and they can continue to have a good quality of life, because you're accepting that what allows you to function isn't just solely in your head, right? And that's something we could invest in terms of public health measures, and increase and then people who have Alzheimer's today, and the people who care for them, which is another big toll in society, the people who care for people with Alzheimer's, then you could improve the quality of life of people with Alzheimer's now, and you wouldn't have to wait for this biomedical cure to come along. You would be able to, because you would accept that the mind isn't, and it's not purely a brain disease in that sense. It's a disease that is a behavioral disease, and we can affect behavior in other ways by simply interfering with the brain.
So you're actually putting to use Andy Clark's extended cognition hypothesis, right? And trying to utilize to extend cognition more in the outside world, and reduce the cognitive load on the person.
And so that that the cognitive system goes beyond the brain. And if we alter the environment in ways that make it easier for people with Alzheimer's to function, then that can also improve. That will bring their performance up, because you're within that cognitive system, they are functional. And and I think that's, and there's other, Margaret Lock talks about this as well, is that people are living independently, and then they have a fall or something, and they go into hospital, and then after that their decline is very rapid. And it's like, oh, this is really I wonder why they decline so rapidly. And it's like, well, you've now taken them out, you've taken away part of their mind, right? You've taken them out of their environment in which they are functional into the hospital, and now they don't have any of the labels and the intelligent use of space by laying out their living spaces, by making sure that they are scaffolded by their environment. You've now put them in a completely different environment that doesn't have any of those scaffolds, and you're like, oh, their functioning has gone right down. Because you haven't recognized how much of you've drawn the boundaries of the cognitive system purely around the person and purely around their brain. And if you drew it around the person in their environment, then they would have continued to be functional for much longer. And so we're sort of missing the target there.
And Gibson also becomes relevant here, right? The disease is not about the organism. Disease can be framed more in terms of the animal environment interactions. At least in these domain.
Absolutely. I say this, in my lectures, when I had to sort of teach aspects of social psychology, you sort of say, when we talk about accessible buildings, and you sort of say, oh, this building, these people can't use this building because it doesn't have a wheelchair ramp, and you sort of make it the problem of the disabled person, that they can't access, and in fact you could change the environment and the building would become immediately accessible. And so the problem is the organism environment interaction. The problem is the lack of fit between the organism and the environment. The lack of fit, the problem doesn't sit in the disabled person. It sits in the relation between that person and the world.
It's so interesting, like when it comes to certain forms of disability. So if you think about myopic vision, right? We had glasses, and we made glasses fashionable to an extent that now myopic vision or in most of the visual problems are no more a taboo, and they are kind of integrated in your lifestyle. Like kids have myopic visions these days. Like a 7-year-old can have a myopic vision, and that's completely fine. But for some diseases, it becomes a taboo, or it becomes like a very apparent disability, and you are certainly outcasted from your regular life and sociology. Right. And probably we'll be able to, like there might be some time, when people might be able to flaunt like, oh, I have Parkinson's. Like I don't know what it will entail, but it might be at some point possible.
I just think if we just recognize that Parkinson's is a bit different, but certainly things like Alzheimer's, where you can set the world up in a way that compensates, or the supports are there to allow you to, to sort of say, you might then be able to say they're living with Alzheimer's and not suffering from Alzheimer's, or do you know what I mean? That you would just say, okay, well, and then you would understand the accommodations that have to be made for people who are living like that they would have to be able to you'd have to sort of meet them on their own terms and understand that their cognitive system isn't just them, and you'd have to alter the way you engage with those people and where you met them and how you dealt with them, and like, you know, made it possible for them to carry on being functional. You'd have to adjust our world would have to adjust a bit more to them. And if we thought that was something we wanted to do, we could do it. You know, we could.
Right.
I mean, the same way in people who are deaf are very isolated from many aspects of society. But if we all spoke sign language, they wouldn't be. Right.
Right. Completely agree.
We could all, you know, so there's a very nice book called Everyone Here Spoke Sign Language, which is about Martha's Vineyard, where up till, I don't know, sort of, I think it was even the early 19th century, they had very high levels of hereditary deafness, because they all were immigrants from a particular part of Kent in England, and they were all interbred. And so there was lots of deafness, and it would pop up in these unusual ways because the interbreeding was so, you couldn't really predict where it would come from because everyone was so interbred. Everyone in Martha's Vineyard just spoke sign language. And so deaf people were the mayor was deaf, they were fishermen, they owned businesses, they ran shops. There was no sense in which deaf people weren't fully integrated, because they weren't, in a sense, deafness wasn't in that sense a thing, because they were not handicapped by their disability. They weren't handicapped anyway, because they could converse on the same level. And then there was, the book is very nice, it's an oral history, and this woman keeps saying, do you remember anything, or do you remember anything about Bob, or do you remember anything about, you know, she's asking all these very old people, and they go, no, I can't remember anything unusual about. And then she'll go, was he deaf? And they'll go, oh, come to think of it, he was. Now that's the thing, that's an amazing thing, isn't it? Because if you encountered a deaf person in your everyday world, you would notice their deafness. And this kind of thing is the thing to, you're like, oh yeah, that's right, he was. And then people in the shops, there would be all these men in the general store telling off-color jokes to each other, and then a woman would enter and they would immediately just start doing it in sign language so that they wouldn't offend her. And so you could then, like, it was like how it wasn't just a thing that you used with deaf people. Hearing people used it, you know, it became a really integral part of how Martha's Vineyard Society worked. It's a really great book, and it just makes you realize how you could alter the environment, alter how you view how you view people's cognitive functioning once you change the environment, and you don't necessarily change the people.
It's so interesting when you actually look at the statistics. So, for example, look at how many people are visually impaired, how many auditorily impaired, how many people have Parkinson's, Alzheimer, or amputations. The number adds up. It's a significant proportion of population. And then you wonder, like, okay, I meet like 200 people a day. I see 200 people a day, in cafes, bars, and like department, and, in the bus, and, on the road. None of them have that. So where are these people? They are completely excluded from society in general. That's why we don't see them, but they're pretty high in number. Right. So that brings me to the idea of, let's start with one of the most common thing called Neuralink. Technologies like Neuralink, right, which makes a lot of noise, and they have been making. So, and every time I meet somebody and I tell them, like, okay, I'm a experimental psychologist or neuroscientist, or, I'm a mind scientist, broadly speaking. And everyone asks me, what do you think of Neuralink? And you know what I would say about Neuralink, but I wanted to know what you think about things like Neuralink, because common people who are not inside the boundaries of academic silos, they think about these technologies very differently than people who understand the brain like you. So what do you think of these technologies?
What do you think of Neuralink? Tell me, what's your view of it then?
I think at multiple levels. I mean, the idea, of course, you can think about anything. I can think about, I can think of myself as a dictator of a republic. That's also possible. So in terms of the possibility, you're allowed to think about it. But in terms of what we know about the brain, how it operates, and the promises which comes with it, or any of these technologies, to me, they just sound dishonest. I don't want to say a scam, but definitely dishonest. No person who understands the brain or who has actually seen a neural recording or even looked at ensemble level neural recording would ever talk about these technologies the way media talks about and the way these are promoted.
Yeah, I think my view would be the same. And I think lay people's people, who are neuroscientifically sort of literate in that way, I think they get a lot of the way I see Neuralink being promoted and the way people talk about it. They just talk about a bit like it's an easy way to kind of learn things and be more functional in the world, and it'll be brilliant because it'll be like in the Matrix where they just plugged a thing into the back of Keanu Reeves's head and then he wakes up and he goes, oh, I know kung fu. And it's like, do you know what I mean? It's like oh, it'll be like a get rich quick scheme. Do you know what I mean? You won't have to put in any effort and you'll acquire all these skills, a bit like, and it's like all these things. So this new drug, Ozempic, which will cure obesity or cure, you just don't have to worry anymore. You'll just be able to take this drug and it will solve everything. And I think that's a very human thing. We want a quick fix, and we don't want to sort of take personal responsibility for those things. We want it to not be our fault that we don't know lots of things and we don't have these particular skills, or we are too overweight or too this or too that. You just want to be able to have someone solve it and then go, oh, it wasn't really your fault, here's a thing, this will fix everything. And I think that Neuralink all those kind of Neuralink things, they play into that way of thinking, that here you can be a better person for no effort. And if you know what it really takes to build a skill, or if you really know what it takes to like how the brain works, you just think you're being sold a lemon here, because those things are never going to pan out in the way you think. And I find Elon Musk very interesting, because it's like I can never work out whether he is just massively naive and doesn't really know, he doesn't delve into things very deeply, so he has a knowledge that's sort of broad but very shallow, and so he really believes that this stuff will work, or if he's just deeply cynical.
We need some fMRI scans to figure that out.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure there are technologies to figure that out. And
it just seems wildly overly optimistic to me. And I also think it's part of that. There's a sort of transhumanist, we can transcend the limits of our kind of quite rubbishy bodies. Do you know what I mean? And I often feel that the people who advance those things they're not particularly impressed by the human body as it exists. It's all a bit leaky, a bit smelly, a bit suboptimal. If we could just make ourselves into these sleek machines, and be super intelligent, it would be so much better. And I just sort of quite like being a smelly, leaky person. I think that's
I always say that before you start,
being a living being is pretty good.
Right. So the way I have been saying, like, for example, my friends always talk to me about like Neuralink and Mars mission and things like that, we inhabiting Mars. And I always tell them, like, why don't you pack your bags and just go to Thar Desert, or, like Death Valley or Egypt, some desert in Egypt, and just spend like a week there, grow your potatoes and come back. And then we'll talk about the Mars mission, do you understand any bit of physiology? Like, go from G to like 2G for a few minutes, that does so much damage to your body. Right. So things of that nature. But I also feel that the things of this sort and a lot of popular science, and when it becomes like a meme, they do a little disservice, because it puts hope in the wrong baskets, and it devalues real theoretical meticulous development of knowledge for these short-term solutions or these fancy kind of punchlines, which I think scientists are also are under increasing pressure to get, in a timely manner to accelerate their careers, right? So the reward has been shifted to meticulous work, generally speaking, to this kind of jingoism, I feel.
Yeah. Do you think it's also all these Neuralink and all these living on Mars and all this guys, it's like partly because we've become it's very easy to dissociate from your body in the modern world. Like if you're very online and do you know what I mean? I don't think I find like a lot of my students don't think about their bodies very much, and they spend a lot of time online, and do you know what I mean? They're not sort of very, they really do think of themselves as minds, and their bodies are just the things they carry their minds around, rather than thinking that their bodies are part and parcel of what makes their minds. Do you know what I mean? They really have a very dualist view of themselves.
I think I'll say yes, there are students like that. I think we have, I would classify, broadly speaking, students in two categories. Like one who are overly physical, like everything is about physical sports, the body, right? Like body chauvinism. Okay.
Yeah.
And we have this in common culture as well, right? For example, looks are everything, and how your body looks everything. You might have low brain energy, you might have a disease, but it must look in shape. So there's body chauvinism, and then you have this brain chauvinism. There's no like, okay, I'm a fully functional human being, and I'm feeling high in energy, and I might not look exactly the same shape, or I might not fit a kind of a model image, but I'm healthy, I have the stamina, and I can run. So it's like, I will run a marathon and see, I've run these many marathons. Or it's like, oh, I'm really good with coding. So you see, like, there's less of coherence between the two, in generally speaking. And I myself suffer with it, if I look at my lifestyle, I myself have compromised on one or the other at different points.
Yeah.
But I think we have the sociology which favors one or the other in general, and you kind of drift into that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So, but like we talked so much about these things, and you don't record from the brain. I don't myself record from the brain, on an everyday basis. And someone can come and criticize that you folks, that like, you don't have money where your mouth is. You're studying behavior, you're studying monkeys, and you have so much to say about the brain. So it's very easy to say about brain and these things and what's wrong with science in general, when you're outsider and when you're actually not have any stakes in science itself. So how would you respond to that?
Well, I think that if the work I do on monkeys, what I'm interested in is how sociality and brain size evolution are linked, and there's lots of theorizing about why it is that primates have such large relative brain sizes, and humans have the largest relative brain size of all. And there's clearly, well, not clearly, the hypothesis is that that is in some way linked to sociality. And so I don't necessarily work on brains myself, but I work on an organism that has a brain, and I'm interested in how its brain got to be the way it is, and what that means for its behavior, and why the primates that I've worked on are so phenotypically plastic and behaviorally flexible. So I would say how people are understanding and presenting the brain in neuroscience is of relevance to me, because it feeds into what I do, and the picture that they're generating of the brain is influencing the ways in which theories of what primate brains are for and how they do their job infiltrate into my area of research. And then I think it should be a reciprocal thing, that I should be able to say, well, this is how they're behaving, and these are the kinds of limits on, or the limits on their flexibility seem to come here, and they and these are the areas where they seem less flexible. Surely that's would be of interest to people who study the brain. So I don't think just because you don't study the brain directly that you don't have a stake in or an interest in how brains function and how people study them. And so yeah, I think that the kinds of ways in which neuroscientists talk about the brain, there's another way in which I think it definitely affects me personally as someone who works on non-human animals, is that when you have these computational metaphors and the notion of information processing is presented to you in a certain way, and you go to a talk by a neuroscientist and they're talking about neural coding, and then they talk about representations, and they start talking about symbolic, the manipulation of symbolic structures. Do you know what I mean? And it's all like, and that's how the brain works. And I sort of think, well, a lot of what you're talking about, I could see how a human brain could deal in symbolic structures. It's like, because we are symbolic creatures, we have language. I can see how you could then make an argument for how the brain deals with symbols. I wouldn't say it's a symbolic thing in and of itself, but this is how the brain deals with symbols, and this is how the representations work. And I can see, if you're talking about humans, I'm willing to accept that there's something there that we need to maybe discuss and talk about, and then maybe there is part of how the brain functions that's to do with those things. But then the way in which it gets articulated in terms of non-human animals is then you just go, oh, and so there must be these precursors in non-human animals, these proto-symbolic structures, or these proto-linguistic things. So you're anchoring other creatures to us, and they've always got to have the proto-whatevers or the pre-whatevers of whatever we have. And you're not treating them on their own terms, because they're always being anchored to a human standard. And two, they just aren't linguistic creatures. So however they see the world and however what their brains are doing, I don't think it can be doing those things that we talk about when we often talk about in neuroscience, where it's clearly we're talking about a very anthropocentric notion of the brain, even as model animals are being used, and even though, it's still very anthropocentrically oriented. And if you're a genuinely evolutionary person, that can't work, because you're beginning with an anthropocentric view and projecting it back onto other animals, which just isn't the way to go about doing an evolutionary analysis.
Right. So that explains why you wrote in your article, the famous one, why brains are not computers and why dolphins are not aquatic apes, right? But you also said why behaviorism is not Satanism.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Well, two things. That if you mention behaviorism and you mention people like B.F. Skinner, people will immediately just put up the sign of the cross and just go, oh, and talk about how that's a spent force, and it was wrong, and it wasn't wrong. And there's a lot to be said for radical behaviorism as a philosophy, and there's a lot to be said for some of the findings that came about through behaviorist analysis, and it's still a going concern. So I think people just use it. Somebody wrote this very nice thing, that you use the word behaviorism to scare little children in the dark, and it's just the thing you say to people it seems to me, to denigrate them if they question a cognitivist analysis. And and if you present something that's not cognitivist in orientation, people say, oh, that sounds like behaviorism. And and that's meant to stop you right there. Like, that's meant to be a killer knockdown argument that you can't come back from. And the reason I say is, like, okay, it is behaviorism, but what's wrong with that? Tell me what's wrong with it. Don't just sneer and say it's behaviorist. And I think you've got to face up to the fact that there is a lot of the world associative learning, or whatever you want to call it, explains a lot of human and non-human behavior. And I find it very funny that everyone goes, oh, that sounds like behaviorism. And then the next thing they do is, like, their phone goes ding and they have to get their phone out and look at it.
Exactly. So this is what I was trying to come at. Like, if you look at right now, we have behaviorism in its full-fledged form being practiced across the society, right? And it's so funny that we kind of reject behaviorism when we are all part of this giant experiment, which is based on behaviorism.
Yes, exactly. So I've, now, like, you can't, this word gamification.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? You make things into games, and then people, and that's nothing but learning theory. That is pure operant conditioning.
Yeah.
And people want to deny it, and then there are books. There are books called things like Addicted, how to make addicted apps, right? You can
yes.
People want to to sort of say, no, behaviorism's all wrong. And it's like,
Yes.
but look around you, you know, and
Exactly.
there's this great book called Addicted by Design, which is all about how casinos are
Yeah.
designed, you know, and it's just B.F. Skinner could have written it.
Yeah, it's so interesting that, when you look at these days, for example, let's say stroke rehabilitation, right? A lot of these gamification of stroke exercises, virtual reality, and things like that. It's behaviorism as play everywhere in those paradigms. Just because you can measure something from the brain and you can see something changing inside the brain doesn't mean that it's not behaviorism.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
And I think that the reverse is true, is that the thing that people always say, and you see this come up again and again and again, is that Skinner denied there was anything going on in the organism. Skinner denied there was
And he never did.
And he never did, right?
Yeah.
He just said there's a science of behavior.
Yes.
And what we're trying to do is then, if we understand, you know, the functional relations between, you know, that come about through the antecedent, the behavior, the consequent, you know, if we understand all these reinforcement schedules and things like that, then we'll be able to tell what the physiologists what they should be looking for. We'll be able to guide, we'll be able to provide a guide to discovery for what you should be looking for in the brain. And if you and his real objection to the kinds of cognitivist things is that you're not explaining things, you're just naming them.
Yes.
You're just giving a name to something. You're not actually explaining anything. And if you then say, oh, well, you know, the organism did this because of X, and you stop there and you've just put this thing inside the organism's head, it's like, well, his objection is like, well, you stopped too soon, because how did it get in the head in the first place? We need to understand the developmental history and the evolutionary history of the organism to explain why it is that change has come about, that then leads to an increased probability of that behavior under certain you know, outside stimuli.
Yes.
So yeah, it's a complete misconception. And I suppose the reason why I say behaviorism isn't Satanism is because I just felt like it's just quite funny to wind up cognitivists. It's just quite funny to not crumble to dust when they accuse you of behaviorism, and to also do it in a way that is do you know what I mean? You're to show what they're really trying to do when they say behaviorism is this bad thing.
I would say they are an easy kill, not even interesting.
Yeah. And then the other thing, I suppose, is I often really worry, because of this interest in the history of psychology and the things we've, you know, these kind of, I find these historical ways in which things come about and things get misunderstood and things fall by the wayside, is it worries me that, you know, we'll be reinventing the wheel. We'll be discovering things that we already knew about.
Yes.
And that's just like, you know, it costs time and money and energy to do these things. Why rediscover the things we already know? Why not spend all our time and energy and resources on finding out new things?
Well, I recently read 2 books by 2 famous neuroscientists, one from the East Coast and one from the West Coast. I won't name the books and the writers, but when you read the book, there's almost no citation to Gibson or ecological or inactivism program. And both the books have the thesis, basically, the body matters. And I was like taken aback by them, like, oh, we have like half a century of work showing that body matters, and it matters. Like, how does it matter, and what's the structure of that mattering? And they have no citations to those. So it seems like they're written in good faith, but at the same time, the writers are completely unaware of this large body of work. Why do you think that's the case? Should we include some neural recordings in, like, what do we need to do to make sure, or what does this community needs to do to make sure that they are listened and basically they get the mileage they need and they deserve when it comes to how we are understanding the mind body?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that's interesting, because we need to, I feel like there's a certain set of people, older people, who are quite set in their ways. I will not name this person either, but I went to a meeting and gave a presentation. There was lots of neuroscientists there, and I talked about Gibson, and somebody asked a clarification question in the middle of my presentation, and I sort of discussed, and it was about affordances, and I gave the thing, and then the famous neuroscientist said, God, I never thought I'd live to see the day that someone defended Gibson in public. And do you know what I mean? And it was, yeah, well, I just thought to myself, well, hang on, because I'm going to be talking about B.F. Skinner in a minute. So it gets even worse,
Yeah.
But I thought that was interesting, that it was sort of like, oh my goodness, I can't believe that you're going to kind of treat Gibson as a sort of reasonable, his notion of affordances is a reasonable thing to defend in the world, because and I spoke to the person afterwards, and he was all like, oh, it's just all this woo stuff, what are affordances? They're just sort of weirdly metaphysical things that don't make any sense. And I was just like, what? They make perfect sense. It's like, what are you talking about? So I think there's a lot of, so maybe it's like a generational thing, and if you just have more interplay and more people speaking up, and people who there are more interdisciplinary kind of meetings, and people come together a bit more, and maybe that will shift it. Because I really like who wrote The Brain from the Inside Out? I can never remember his name.
Buzaki, yeah.
That's one of those books. It's really, but it's a little tiny mentions of Gibson here and there.
It was one of the books I mentioned.
Is it? So it's just
that was the East Coast book, yeah.
He's the East Coast book. I had my suspicions.
Yeah.
But there's these little tiny mentions.
Yeah.
And so I found that very interesting. And I really thought I really enjoyed it. I thought, there are bits where he's talking in that standard cognitivist way, and you just have to, you can easily rephrase it, and you'd come up with a completely ecological interpretation that would do better work for him, I think.
Right.
But he's clearly open to those things, and he clearly thinks that outside in way is completely flawed.
Right.
And
but what's interesting is that that was the way he has written the book. That's like a recent revelation. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Like an epiphany.
Yeah. And so, well, then I'll say a thing, and then I'll interpret that one way, and then I'll interpret it in a more inflammatory way, which is to say, I think that if you are working in the neuroscientific field, I think generally there's so much out there today. Even little tiny disciplines have such a large literature. It's almost impossible to keep up with your own literature in your own small area, let alone keep up with literatures in other areas. It's, even though everyone wants to be more interdisciplinary, in a way, it's never been more easy to be interdisciplinary. At the same time, it's very difficult to do that, because you have to get on board, and you have to bone up on a huge, vast literature that's really, it seems overwhelming to try and take on board. So so in that sense, I can say, I can. And then the more inflammatory way of saying it is, I just feel like in particular disciplines where you have these highly regarded people and the way in which they function, it's often the case that they come to a revelation about something, and then they can't imagine that no one else has had it.
You're so right about that.
They just cannot believe that, they're like, oh my God, I've realized this amazing thing. I must tell the world.
Yes.
I must tell the world, because I've sorted it out now. And I don't think that for some of those kinds of, I do not know if Gary Bazaki is like this at all. He doesn't seem like it when you hear him speak. But, so let's put him to one side, and we're not impugning him in any way. But there is, just in case, I think there is this sense of people, it wouldn't occur to them to go and say, I better look and see if anyone else has had this idea before me. Whereas my thing is exact opposite of that. I kind of go, oh my God, that's a great idea. And the first thing I do is look it up on the internet and discover that somebody else had it in 1923.
Yes.
And then I'm like, oh, and then I'll go and read up about that. And, and maybe it's because I'm sort of a historically oriented person, and I always think it's important to pay your dues to the people who came before you. So it's a temperamental thing. And then there are other sets of people who are just in the now, don't think to do that. So if you have this idea, then you've had this idea, and it wouldn't even occur to you to go and check in the literature to see if it had come up previously.
No, I think it's also part of the training. So, and I faced this dilemma myself. So I read a lot, for example, like historical books and
Yeah.
how we come about to what we know currently. But what happens is uh, most of the time I see students. For example, I'm trying to recruit graduate students now. So I see students in two baskets. So one which are very methodical oriented, and they're really good with programming. They're really good with coding, and I need those skills for the kind of work I want them to do in my lab. At the same time, there are others who are really good theoreticians. They have read a lot of philosophy, but a lot of psychology and a lot of neuroscience as well. But when you look at their skills, which are needed for the kind of work again I'm planning, they don't have that. It will take them years to learn those skills.
Yeah.
What is missing, generally speaking, is both technical competence as well as literary competence. And I think that's not part of the training. We are not taught like that, and basically that takes time. Basically, we don't have time these days to have both at the same time, right?
Yeah. I'd certainly agree that I mean we've been talking about that in the science departments in our university, because it's sort of like there's no sense, our students have no sense of history. They have no sense of where their disciplines have come from and the philosophical underpinnings of those things and how the particular philosophies and metaphors, do you know that thing? I mean, it's
right.
So some people who care about it going, it's only going to get worse, that we're going to get trapped into particular ways of thinking, because people don't even realize. There's a lot of students who, when you talk about these things, they go, oh, that sounds like philosophy.
Yeah.
And you go, yeah, well, and they're like, well, I'm not interested in philosophy. I'm a scientist. I'm just, I just do science. I'm interested in empirical facts. And, and you're like, well, I mean, I'm really sorry, but whether you like it or not, you have a philosophy.
Yeah.
It would benefit you if you actually understood what that philosophy was and were aware of it, and you can see how it's guiding your thinking, and that might be useful. That might be useful to you, but it's sort of like, nope, don't need that. And everyone's sort of thinking, well, in fact, we do need that, and maybe we need to kind of build in a history of science course, or just because the other thing is there's a very big presentist bias, I think, where everyone goes, and then and 200 years ago, or whatever, 400 years ago, they thought there was this stuff called phlogiston, and they thought there was this stuff called the ether, and it's like so hilarious that people thought all these dumb things. And then it's like, we're thinking dumb things
right now.
There are many dumb things that are being thought all around us, and we have not suddenly hit on correct thinking today just because we're living today. And so that kind of presentism is also a bit dangerous. I think
it's so interesting that when you look at, for example, ether, or for example, let's say the brain as a pneumatic device or something, there were very few people who used to believe that, because most people never cared about it. It was like few thinkers and philosophers, right? But now we have not just scientists and researchers, and we have doctors, and we have common population as well thinking about the brain as computer. So if you go back like 200 years probably, and if we have a good luck and we are able to solve this mess, then we'll look back and say, like, how is that the whole civilization thought that it was computer, right? Our ancestors used to be so stupid. That's what our grandkids would think.
Yeah, indeed, exactly.
So what do you think is required? Like what are we missing from education? Where do you think where we can tackle this much early on? I think it's more an early problem now, because once you are tenured, not many things can be changed, right? So if you have to target, and if you have to make things, if you have to correct these things, where should we look for correcting? At what stage of a career?
Yeah, I think I don't know much about high school education, but certainly early university education. I think we need to increase the breadth of what we teach students in terms of the history and philosophy of their particularly something like psychology. And make the big shift I see from when people come from high school to university is this realization that science isn't just a body of facts and knowledge, it's a way of doing things, and that all the things they get taught in high school are sort of a bit wrong. And then they're like, that was, and that hits all our students quite hard, and they need to get, I think maybe we could begin earlier teaching that science is a process and it's a human activity, and the ways in which, we tried this and we tried that and this was wrong and this worked, and we're never 100% sure we're right. It's always provisional. I don't think there's enough of that. And that's why during the pandemic, I remember talking to like my neighbors and everything like that, and it's like, oh, it's wear masks, don't wear masks, do this, don't do that, no one knows what's going on. And I was kind of going, no, but at the time, with the best information we had, this seemed like what was going on, so that was the best advice then. And then we got more evidence, and so people changed their minds. And to me, it's like, that's quite normal. That's exactly what you would do,
right?
As you go. And they were like, no, it just shows that nobody knows what they're doing. And I think that's that's the problem. The idea that you when you test a hypothesis and you find that it's supported, boom, there's knowledge. Unmovable, unshakable facts about
written
the
in
world.
stone.
Written in stone from that point on. That's what we've got to change.
Okay.
I think, so that people understand science, the scientific process, and don't think that scientists are special human beings. That they're just human beings, like we're just the same as everyone else, and get rid of these. I think that would be a huge service, is to have a more realistic understanding of the scientific process and what it can achieve and what it can't. And that doesn't mean go to the other extreme, because we've done extraordinary things scientifically. But I think it's kind of interesting to study the way some of those things came about, and the sort of accidents, make more of the accidents and more of the contingent ways in which these things have been discovered, rather than
luck play a more substantial role in general.
And like most scientific discoveries come about because somebody goes, that's funny.
That's
a bit weird, what happened there? It's not someone having this light bulb moment of inspiration, and it's much more messy, because then I think it makes it clear that anyone can do it.
We have imposed a lot of artificial constraint, right? Deadlines, grants, these many publications. A lot of those artificial constraints actually impose what we can do and what we can think in general. In the academic structure.
So maybe part of it is this like professionalization of science. That it's become this career path in a particular way.
Right.
Whereas if you read a bit, particularly in the history of England, it's all just country vicars doing experiments in their gardens and things. I know that sort of in and of itself, people go, oh, that's a problem. It was just a particular section of society and only independently. And I mean, that's all sort of true. But at the same time, that kind of tradition of the amateur who just had a bash at something and, discovered things and made a contribution that way. I think if I like reading very old editions of Nature. Have you seen that, where they have this like, dear sir, I was walking in the park today and I saw a dog doing the most extraordinary thing, and that was like, those are what letters to Nature used to be like,
right? And you wonder, like, would they ever publish this kind of stuff now? I mean, not at all, right? So I mean, and that was the whole idea. Like it was like nature or science. So let me play devil's advocate here and say that see, you were born decades before me, and we will have people, let's say I'm born in 2100, right? 2100 AD. Now, for you, the history was like a little bit, and for that person being born in 2100 AD, they'll be like, you see, like almost a 1.5 century more of history. So the burden of reading history and being historically informed is more and more for every new generation. So how, and as well as not just the burden of history, the rate of growth of knowledge is exponential. So do you think it's inevitable, just by this constraint, that the younger generations would be more siloed and would be less historically literate, just out of this
I think yes volume? I mean, I think if you're going to take a step back and be realistic about it, that has to be true, isn't it? That used to be a time where you could know everything there was to know. Like to be there's I can't remember what it was now, but I remember reading something about, it was like a particular date And that was the last time you could know everything there was to know. Like you could read all of the stuff that was there, and you would know everything there was to know, kind of thing. And now it's just impossible to do that.
Yes.
And it's going to carry on being impossible to do that. So yeah, I think inevitably, for all my saying that we need to be more historically oriented, it is, you're quite right, it's becoming more and more difficult to do that. And I think it's becoming less and less possible to keep up, even with everything in our own discipline.
Yeah.
You can't keep on top of it, let alone keep on top of more than one discipline. On the other hand, I like to read very widely and do things. Do you know what I mean? I'm not particularly single-minded about what I do.
Yeah.
And perhaps as a consequence of that, I've not been as professionally successful as I might have been. But on the other hand, I've had a better time, and I feel like I would say
you're very successful, but for most standards, yeah.
No, but okay, well, say that's true, right?
Yeah.
That didn't come about by having a single-minded focus.
Yes.
Right. If it came about through going, oh, that's interesting over here, and I don't, this doesn't satisfy me. There must be a better way of thinking about this, and looking over there and being open to, like, following my nose, reading things on a whim, going into different areas on a whim. And I suppose in a way the benefit I've had as well is of being a university academic. And for me, and I think this is getting less and less common, but for me, the reason why I wanted to work in a university is I really like teaching. And I think and research for me is, you do your research in the service of teaching, because that's what allows you to keep on top of things and, convey enthusiasm. And so I like teaching because that's always a good chance to go find out about something you didn't know about and convey it to people in a way that could inspire them to go and do it. So a lot of what I've ended up so my book began as a lecture course, and the reason that came about is because my husband and I got jobs in the same department, and we had been previously in different departments, and we had taught more or less the same thing, and we came to the same place. It's like, well, you can't teach the same thing. And Peter just went dibs on this first, and then it's like, oh, I'm going to have to come up with another course. God.
Right.
So I was like, right. And then I just started encountering things like books like The Embodied Mind, Thompson, Roche and Favela, and books like Being There by Andy Clark and Gibson's work. And it's like, right, let me start looking into this then. This could be a good course.
Yeah.
And it sort of came from there. And then I got more interested in that in a way that wouldn't work for a lecture course, and went into it and did more. And then started thinking about my own empirical work in those kinds of ways and trying to apply it there. So I don't know if you could if you could make a shift in the whole discipline, but I think there will always be people who will have more of a generalist, butterfly kind of mind, who like to flip between things and learn about as opposed to so you've got to make room for all of those people, and not just continually reward people who are very, very single-minded. And recognize there are different kinds there are specialists and generalists, and we need both of them.
Yes. So and how are you able to manage all this? Like I saw your lab, you have a lot of graduate students, you have postdocs, you have undergrads in your lab, and you have a whole program running in South Africa. So that takes a lot of work along with the classes. So how do you keep up with the literature, and how do you keep up with reading so many books and so many interesting books? I mean, I'd compliment that your selection, your name dropping of books is like, it's really eclectic, and each of those books has a story to tell, unlike repetitions. So what's your source of getting to know about these books, and how do you keep up with them? How do you get the time?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I just get up early in the morning. I mean, I really like reading, right? I've always been a bookworm, and so I will always have my nose in a book. I don't like going anywhere without one. So temperamentally, I'm a big reader, and I like it very much. And so I get up early in the morning and I spend 2 hours every morning reading, and I read whatever I fancy, not what I feel like I should read. I read whatever, and then if you read like that, that will link onto something else and then to something. Do you know what I mean? You just sort of leapfrog your way, and then you end up in these interesting places. So that's one thing. I mean, the other thing is Peter and I, my husband, we collaborate on our research, and we run our labs together. So we kind of share so it's not just me on my own. We share the burden that way. So that's useful. We have different strengths, and so it's, you know, that, I mean, it means that our students can always find one of us to talk to, and we do a lot of sort of that vertical mentoring where more junior people are mentored by the slightly more senior people, and we all work. And I mean, I just feel like we all work together. The whole point is to say we're all in this together. I don't encourage any kind of competition. Everything is collaborative. Everything is done for those kind of ideals that we have, the Mertonian norms of science. You know, I try to make people think like that. I think I'm probably training my trainees very, very badly for the modern world. They probably doing no favors whatsoever. But, and so the other thing about that is, because they often are also of a similar type, like they also like to read, and so we have reading groups, and we try to be very eclectic in our reading group. It's not always just reading journal articles. We bring in other things as well. So it's just sort of saying, yes, it's good to be sort of Catholic in your taste, eclectic in your taste, because you never know where a good idea will come from. And so if you're always sort of open to things, you get more inspiration that way. So yeah, so it's no, sorry, carry on.
So I was asking, like, do you both read the same books, or you like, I'll read this one and I'll summarize you, and then together we can read like twice the number of books?
No. It's rare that we read the same kinds of things. Every so often it'll be something like I get so into it that Peter will be, and he'll also read it. But I mean, he's not such a big reader as me. There's a cartoon in the New Yorker that he found, and it's like this man sitting in a chair and he's just throwing a book over his shoulder, and the caption says, "The man who knew enough." And he says that's how, you know, he feels like that. It's like, I just know enough now. I'm done. So he's more, I mean, interestingly, I would say I did ecology as maybe it's my history of education. So I did ecology as my first degree. And then I started doing zoology, and then I moved into ecology. And then I did anthropology for my PhD, biological anthropology. So I've moved to that in disciplines. And then I ended up in a psychology department, for which I am not qualified at all. And then I was in a biology department, then back to a psychology department. So I've had this kind of move in between all these different. So I have no respect for disciplinary boundaries either, right? You know, they're just made up stupid things.
Oh, and I was reading something interesting, that how these boundaries are also made in a very spatial sense. So when you study atoms, you are in the physics department, and when you start studying molecules, you go to the chemistry. Then you go to the cell biology department. Then you have the physiology department. Then you have the behavior department, and the economics department, and the sociology department. So each of the department has actually, somebody has said, like, we should label them, you know, like 10 to the power of 2, 10 to the power of 3 department, 10 to the power of 4 department. It's so funny how departments are structured.
Exactly. So I mean, I think just like as a 19th century, like, we've got to put all these people somewhere. We'll put all the, you know, they've just got to all live in a particular bit of the building. And that's, you know, that's all that. So I came into psychology from that route. And so I'm very interested in these psychological topics now. And then Peter came, he is a psychologist he actually did English literature, and then he did psychology. And then he became more interested in evolutionary things and evolutionary biology and behavioral ecology. So he mostly reads things in behavioral ecology and animal behavior, because that's not something he was brought up with. So we've kind of gone into, we've come at it from two opposite directions. So that works really well as well, because that's very complementary.
Also for the students.
Exactly. So that's a really nice thing, because I often think in very adaptationist ways, and then I'll go, yeah, the reason that evolved is because blah, 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 not so much, and then people go, well, how would that come about? Like, how would the animal, what would it be doing in the world that could possibly pan out in that way? And it's like, that's a thought, because
yes,
and
it's
that's
very
a big
valid
theme.
question.
Yeah, so I say, like, one of the themes in the book is to say there's no sort of necessary link between the nature of proximate mechanism and the ultimate function of that behavior. And they don't have to be equivalent in complexity. That's a big lesson that I learned from Peter, and just walking around watching baboons and vervets and things, and him and me, and talking about what they were getting up to and how we could explain those things evolutionarily, and me just never having, like, this is very early on when we were like doing this, just never really thinking deeply about what it would take for what kind of proximate mechanism could possibly evolve to enable that. So I have to kind of give him credit for why that's such a big theme in the book, because that was the thing I completely lacked. And that to me came about as a revelation that there's no necessary and direct link between those things. And then the more I really like it when you can find a very simple mechanism that has these cascading effects, and that seems to me like
but you did not give him co-authorship.
No, he didn't do anything. He refused to read any of it. He refused to read, never read it. He refused to read any of it.
I see. Interesting.
It's like, why do I need to read it? You never stop going on about it. I don't need to read it as well.
So I mean, we are close to the end of the conversation. What do you think are some of the open questions we actually, as community of mind scientists, we should actually embark on? Like, how do we choose our battles, and what kind of approaches do we need? Let's say I'm a young person starting my career, and I really want to make a dent in the universe. Like, what's your recommendation for me?
I would say, don't ask me. I'm the wrong person to ask.
But still,
I think one of the big interesting questions, I would say, is that we're kind of at this point where we're coming to realize that the psychological categories that we have, that we're trying to sort of use to understand brain function and brain evolution, that's never going to work, because memory, attention, this executive function, they kind of, a lot of those things came about, like, like on your head behind you, your phrenology head, they kind of came about in a non-evolutionary way. They came about in the, do you know what I mean? They were not necessarily massively theoretically driven. They were just these qualities and traits that we came up with through looking at people, and we then put them into areas of the brain. And now neuroscientists are trying to say, okay, how are these psychological constructs instantiated in the brain? And there's no reason to think that the brain is any way organized like that. That's just a historical accident, and we need to flip it around and do it from the bottom up and understand. And that's when understanding that brains first and foremost are there to enable action in an unpredictable dynamic environment makes a real difference. That's what I would say, is you need to get away from this idea that understanding the brain by using human psychological constructs is never going to work. There's no reason why the brain has to be organized in that way. And
so does it mean we start from the scratch, or does it mean we start reinterpreting existing findings in this new light?
I think you can do both of those things. You can start reinterpreting existing data, and that's, of course, that, because I mean the empirical, in a way, you can always take empirical findings and then give an alternative interpretation to them. And we were talking about that, like in Bizaki's book, a lot of the things he interprets one way, you can easily reinterpret them in a non sort of representations cognitivist way. And then I would say there are people like Paul Cesek and Lee Pessoa, doing all these stuff where they are coming at it from the other direction and trying to understand the evolution of nervous systems and the evolution of the brain in a different kind of way. There are people like and then there are philosophers who are also doing this, like Peter Godfrey Smith and Fred Kieser, the skin brain thesis and all that groovy stuff, who are also trying to come up with an alternative evolutionary, alternative evolutionary pathways that we could have gone, and having a sort of much more biogenic orientation and not such an anthropogenic one or anthropocentric one. So I think those interesting things, you know, to do with minimal cognitive systems, you know, and really what are we getting at when we're saying that something's cognitive?
Yes.
I think that's all really, really worthwhile doing. And so I think you can do both, but I do think that I really like Paul Cisek's work. I think he does really great stuff.
Yeah.
And people like I really like, we've written about this in the Faunus chapter, like Michael Graziano's work is really cool. And I like the way, I mean, I really like his work because I like the way it sort of came about by accident.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like, and they didn't believe themselves. They thought that they might be doing some technical error.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that sort of whole thing appeals to me in the sense that they kind of came about it accidentally, and then they discover this, and those kind of ecological action plans are just such a more interesting way of understanding organisms that kind of speak to life and how life itself works. Do you know what I mean? They're more much more biologically grounded and more interesting as a consequence.
Yeah. I was a little sad that work did not continue and people did not pick up, you know, in the kind of insights it had. It never had that impact. But I think in the future we might revisit it again.
Yeah. And again, I think it's these things, because then once you start doing and getting into those kinds of things, you're making life more difficult for yourself, aren't you? It becomes inherently more difficult and more complicated to work on those kinds. If you're not just looking for a little muscle twitch anymore, but you're looking for you've already made life harder and more complicated.
It definitely makes writing grants much more difficult.
Yeah.
So one last question to you. Are you planning to have a second book or a continuation of your first book? Because I think you have thought a lot after that. And
you know, it's interesting because like time just, it was really true. Like, you know, life speeds up as you get older. So I keep meaning to sit down and do something. But I mean, you know, that the book came out just as I came to Canada, and then that's when we realized, you know, as thanks to the Canadian funding system, thanks to the NSERC funding system, I think it's been really, I've had many more graduate students than I would ever have had if I'd remained in the UK. So helping them, you know, investigate their ideas and getting them, that's taken up a lot of time, and it's been very rewarding. But I do always think that I would like to write something else. So I'll tell you this, and we can see whether it pans out or not. But I was another workshop recently with Tony Shimero. He was also there, and somebody said, "Are you going to write another book to me?" And he said, "Let's do it together. Let's write one together." And what we should do is, because our books came out roughly the same time, and I didn't have enough. It came out too late for me to put it into my book, and you know, mine came out after Tony's was published. So it would be like, oh, it'd be good if we got together and said, okay, what did we get right? What did we get wrong? You know, like have a second edition that combined those things. And I don't know if you're probably too young, but do you know who Donny and Marie Osmond are? So they were the Osmonds. They were like these singers in the 70s, and Donny and Marie had a television show, and like, so Donny Osmond was the bloke, and Marie Osmond was his sister. And then they used to begin their television shows, and they used to have a song, and he would sing, she would sing, "He's a little bit country," and then he would say, "And I'm a little bit rock and roll." And so Tony said, yeah, we're like the Donny and Marie of embodied cognition.
Yeah.
So we should write a book together.
That would be a fun read.
Yeah. So I think that might be something that we made a plan to, because he's finishing off a new book of his own, and but we made a plan that maybe that would be a fun thing to do, is to have sort of an update that combined both our books together. And because I think in the interim, I have become more radical and more, you know, less enamored of I mean, I'm less generous towards representationism than I was in my book originally, I think.
I mean, less generous or not generous at all?
Yeah. So I say, I sort of say I'm more radical, but you know, people say, oh, I go quite rabid about this actually.
Yes.
But yeah, I think maybe I have got much more radical I think just because once you get into it, you realize that people are not using representation in any way that makes any consistent or coherent sense.
Right.
And they don't really know what they mean when they talk about them.
Right.
They seem
It's
to like, you know, Louis was saying on your previous podcast, you know, when you ask in that paper with Edward Mashery, like if you ask people, there's all kinds of things they don't really know how they're being used. It's a kind of it's a bit like the word cognition. It kind of almost doesn't mean anything.
In fact, I'm actually planning to have an episode on representations and coding.
Excellent. Well, that would be a must watch for me.
Yes.
Yeah.
So any book recommendations you have in your list of eclectic books?
Well, you know, this one is like, this is like a big fat one, but oh, have you read The Idea of the Brain by Matt Cobb?
Oh, beautiful book.
That's beautiful.
Beautiful book,
know about that one.
I mean, that's my recommendation to any student who wants to learn the history of neuroscience in a very palatable way. I think that's the best book. And I was in touch with him, by the way, regarding the book, and I think on Twitter as well, or I don't know, there's some conversation happened between us.
Yeah, it's such a good read.
Yes,
it's really, really good. This The Ecology of the Brain. Do you know this one by Thomas Spitz?
Oh, I don't know this one.
Oh, this is a good one.
The Ecology of the Brain.
Yeah, love that
Great.
one. Let me just see what I've got. Oh, this is good. Bodies and Other Objects.
Bodies and Other Objects. I did read one book yesterday based on your recommendation from another interview you did, the Phenomenological Mind, I guess. Yeah, I read it yesterday. It's a bit, it was a beautiful read. It's by, I have it here. The Sean Gallagher.
Oh, Sean
and
Gallagher.
Dan Zahavi.
Yes.
And you had a really good words. You had a lot of good to say about that book in one of the previous interviews, and that made me read that book.
And
it was beautiful.
Sean Gallagher I love Sean Gallagher's his book Inactivist Interventions is really good.
Okay, I haven't read this one.
I'll
try that one as well.
It's like a series of essays, and he brings in pragmatism and shows that traditional pragmatist thought has a lot to offer in activism. And he could have. I wrote a commentary on it where I was like, you need, like, you know, he also brings in a bit of Gibson, but it's clearly the links with ecological psychology. He makes those as well, and so that's I like the way he writes as well. He always writes very beautifully and in a very calm and measured way. He always sounds very sane. And do you know what I mean?
It is the case, yes. It is the case.
It's very So, and then this one, this is one that one of my graduate students recommended to me. So it's a bit of a doorstopper, but Louis Sass is really good. So he also has this other book called The Delusions of Paradox, where he looks at schizophrenia and ties it to this isn't going to sound like a winner, but he ties it to he ties it to Wittgenstein's notions of solipsism. And what he's saying is that what happens in schizophrenia is when you lose touch with reality, it's not necessarily the case. If you look at what people with schizophrenia say, it's not that they start hallucinating things that aren't there. It's just that actual reality starts to become very unreal to them. And he says that's what Wittgenstein talks about with solipsism, that you get so wound up in your own, you start experiencing your own experience and becoming very detached from the world. And so everything starts to seem very unreal. And that's often the source of madness, and it's a completely different way of thinking about it. It's really good.
We'll talk about that at some point about schizophrenia, because I had always been thinking about formulating schizophrenia from the ecological perspective, because you suddenly when you talk about the animal environment, there's something odd happening there in terms of the fit and in terms of how the brain functions. And I think it's a nice case study, a disease, a lot to think about there.
So I mean, this kind of thing, like often when you think about people losing touch with reality, and a lot of it doesn't really make sense to me, thinking ecologically or thinking in that sense. So his book comes about very differently, and you can see how a very literally, and particularly like a linguistic and also literate mind could sort of send itself mad through those things, and getting so caught up and so reflexive that you end up driving yourself mad, kind of thing, when you lose and so it's not the same kind of thing that you often get characterized, which doesn't make much sense to me, but as you see it on how it's depicted on the television. So,
but since you talked about loopiness, do you think there's some scope of bringing Douglas Hofstadter's work here?
Whose work, sorry?
Douglas Hofstadter. I'm a strange loop, and in general, Godard Ash back. I mean, he's representationalist in some ways, or computational, but still the idea of loops and the idea of infinite regression makes some sense in the context of the brain.
I agree, right? I think those ideas of loopiness and the way he talks about that, what is that book like? I is a vortex. What's that book called?
I'm a vortex, I guess.
I'm
a strange loop. I'm a strange loop.
Yeah, I'm a strange loop.
Yeah.
Yes. So yeah, I think. I mean, he's obviously like extraordinarily clever and all these things.
And witty.
And very witty. So I read his books, but often they just seem to just go off on these tangents, and you have to really go along for a very long ride with him. So I think there are certain ideas in there that you could rein in a bit and apply, for sure. But sometimes I think what I really like about it is you just get this sense of him going, right, here we go. I'm off on my journey. I'm going to see where I go. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of, the journey is almost more important than the destination, it seems to me.
I think his work is must read. I mean, especially when you're like sampling and when you want to strike the luck. I think it's part of that platter you want to taste.
It's very enjoyable. I think it's really enjoyable. It's just like, and it does make your mind.
And there's nothing parallel to that. I mean, it's of its own kind. It's a genre in itself.
Yes, exactly. Hofstadter studies, indeed. So just before this book is what Louise says is how if you look at modern art and literature and thought, like the way in which modernism comes about and has influenced our views of the mind, and then it also influences our views of madness, and he ties these things together. And I think this, I've only just started, but it's really good, really interesting. And the reason why I'm kind of into it, do you know Ed Reed's books?
Encountering the World, one of my favorites.
So this, like From Soul to Mind, the thing about this one, because I was just checking it, because he in this one he begins with the way in which the beginnings of psychology as a discipline sort of coincide with the novel, the invention of the novel as a way of and the how we understand people coming about through novelistic means, and how we should, why is it that more people, so he brings in this notion that those two things are actually quite tightly linked together in how psychology as a discipline arose, and the invention of the novel. And there's a British author called David Lodge who wrote a book called Consciousness in the Novel, and I love it because what he says is you'll learn more about consciousness by reading Henry James than you will by reading any neuroscience textbook. And it's
I completely agree with you. I think when I was it who wrote the book Darkness at Noon? Arthur Koestler, I guess. That's also one of my favorites. I mean you read, you understand about human condition more from that book, Darkness at Noon, than like any literary stuff coming out of the academic circles.
So that's so Neil, my former student, he was saying, oh well, you'll love Louis Sass, then you should read this, because that's what he's saying, that and there are these interlinkages between these things, and that we are getting a lot of our, the modernism and our ideas of the mind and our ideas of madness are all quite tightly linked together. So I'm very into that. I like and I completely agree, like with David Lodge, he's very right that you do learn more about consciousness by reading a novel than reading a neuroscience book.
I don't want to name, I've been very disappointed by reading consciousness from the neuroscience community, to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, the
Yeah.
point about it is I think they just want to try to explain it away all the time. Everything's an illusion,
Yeah.
isn't it? Always
Yeah.
an illusion, because you can't,
Yeah.
because really human experience doesn't really feature in
No.
scientific
And I think there's
if it doesn't, if it can't get in there, then it has to be an illusion. And I think
right.
that doesn't follow logically.
And
That's
and there's also a kind of lopsided mission of localizing consciousness as well.
Yeah.
You know, so there's always an implicit search where it is hiding. So that kind of also makes it a little I would say
and then
boring.
I've got one last recommendation, which is a documentary. Have you seen that? It's called In Silico.
No.
So it's about Henry Markram's 10-year.
Oh, I know about that
Human
story of
brain
Henry
project.
Markram's. That's
So it's all of it's
okay.
When he started, and Henry Markram said, in 10 years time, I'm going to build a simulation of the brain.
Yes.
In 10 years time, we're going to have a simulation of the human brain, or a mouse brain or whatever. And this former student of his became a documentary maker, and he said, right, I'm going to follow you for 10 years then. And so this documentary follows the 10 years of
nice.
And it's, you know, the whole thing of the human, you know, where they got like a bajillion euros to do their, you know, to do the human brain project, and then that all went tits up and everything like that. And so it's a really good documentary. It's very very good. So because it's both inside and outside, you know what I mean? It's
and that very nicely sums up what happens to that project, to our basically recent missions about neuroscience and understanding the brain. I think almost all the mega projects have faced very similar kind of outcome recently.
And I mean, from my point of view, I was he doesn't really touch on this, but you can, you know, all the way through, you know, if you're an ecological type person, you're like, this isn't how to go about it. This isn't how to do this, you know. It makes perfect sense. And I will say this, I used to roll my eyes a lot when I used to read about that project. And when I mean, it's very, very good, because it makes Henry Markram, it's like, man, you are a man with a vision. You are a man with the drive and ambition to do these amazing things. It's a very, very, I still don't agree with him. I still think it's, you know, I still feel it's like an ill-posed project in question, but you do get a massive sense of what a charismatic, like interesting, clever person he is. So it's a really, really good documentary.
No, it was I mean, to be clear to the audience, it was a good faith project. I mean, all these projects are good faith projects. It's just that we put too many eggs in a basket here.
And that's basically the message. So it's really good. You can see how, I mean, he'd make an excellent cult leader, Henry Markram. You know what I mean? He would be a good leader of a cult, because he's just got that charisma.
I mean, isn't that a reality? Well, thanks for putting it softly. So it was pleasure talking to you. I think we covered a lot of grounds here, and I definitely look forward to having you again to talk in more detail about some of the issues we discussed today.
Anytime. It would be a pleasure. This is great.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.